Okay, and we are live, and we are going to be having a great conversation today about Fabric and its place in the modern data estate. And I am just super thrilled to be here to talk about it. And we also have some other special guests. So this is going to be a great conversation. We're going to talk about Fabric. We're going to talk about how it aligns to an estate that you are probably building right now, or one that you have part of and are looking to evolve. This is going to be a particularly frank conversation, so I hope you're ready for it. I'm going to tell you how it is, or at least what I think it is. And I think you're going to have a lot of fun. So um, be very open to put your questions in the chat. Let's hit it as we go. And I'll just start by introducing myself. So my name is Nathan Lesnowski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. I'm also a Microsoft MVP. I have just been really excited about the progress of Fabric over the last several years. It's something that, or several years, a single year, and it is something that has moved from a twinkle in the eye of Microsoft to being something that is truly changing the market in the space of data. So really excited to dig into it today. And then in addition to myself being on this call, we also have Brian Hayden. And Brian Hayden is a solutions architect at Concurrency. You want to say hi, Brian?
I can't, or can I?
Ah,
Can you hear
well, he
me?
can. I can hear him.
Yeah, I wasn't sure because I came in as an attendee, but hi.
Awesome. Good to see you. Brian is going to be around to answer questions in the chat and can maybe poke in where he has some comments as well. All right, so let's get started. I think this is probably something I'm going to want to sit on for a minute to let you kind of consume it. I think it's important as we start talking about Microsoft Fabric to do a little bit of a history on data estates in general. And I think many of us have lived through these different stages. And when I'll admit, when I was first told about Fabric, I was at the Microsoft MVP Summit about a year and a half ago, and I was talking to the person on the lead of the team of Fabric before it was released. And he talked about this cloud data estate. And I was like, why are you doing this? How does this relate to a data mesh? Why is this important? And at the time, I didn't quite understand why this was going to be a good move for them. And now I get it. And I'm hoping to convey like why it's an evolution and why it was brilliant. And then we'll talk through the different components. But let's start with like the history and how it relates to other things. So where I still find a lot of companies, believe it or not, is in this early stage, which we call just exporting to Excel. It's this like spot where you really don't have a mature data warehouse of any kind. You don't have a position of uniting what data means to your organization and providing clarity back out to the organization in the business. And you have various teams working within business systems that export that data from the business system to some form of analysis tool like Excel, and then they take action on that data. But nobody trusts the data after that has been exported because it's lost in time. It's like it's as good as when it was exported, and the shared understanding that's necessary against that data is very limited. But it's something a lot of companies do, and it holds them back. So something we've always perceived to understand as better than that is to create some form of data warehouse. And many of us live through these patterns of building a data warehouse on premise with ETL practices and SSRS reports and collections of report writers that built different reports that were then issued out to sets of consumers. And that in some cases was successful, at least creating some level of agreement, but in many cases it wasn't. In many cases, it spent many years building a data warehouse that was limited by its ability to bring true value, or to take too much time building data warehouse and not enough time actually getting value to the customer. So it oftentimes was struggled with that, but sometimes it made it all the way and it's providing value right now. And I know many companies that that's the case for. But we evolved past that and we started to move into using cloud patterns, and cloud patterns moved to ELT versus ETL. They usually followed a bronze, silver, gold pattern. Their popular examples would be Snowflake or Azure DW, Azure DW Gen 2, usually surfaced through Power BI, and some collection of potentially Tableau at one point in its history. And particularly for Snowflake, this is when it just took off like a rocket, right? Like people were like, I am going to take my data warehouse and I'm going to dump that thing into a Snowflake cloud environment, and then you can go to the ball. And that strategy sometimes paid off for people, but more often than not, they moved a lot of stuff and they got a value from a small fraction of it. And a lot of the stuff that they moved just kind of sits there. So there's a question now with many companies of, did I get value from that? What am I paying for my Snowflake implementation? Is it really doing the right things? Did I bring the data together and gain alignment, or did I just have data sitting in another lake that was from a bunch of separate ponds? And it has some of those same concerns. Now, it moved past the idea of generating this like slow moving behemoth that was the old ETL data warehouse, but it also generated some new problems around getting value to people, which is when other concepts started to take hold, such as what Databricks has been very successful with on Azure, data mesh concepts, lakehouse concepts that have started to emerge. The data mesh pattern in a very practical way, allowing us to use an architecture, but focus sets of concerns and bring that through the cloud ecosystem to a set of consumers, usually being consumed through Power BI. And another place where there's just tremendous momentum and forward movement. The challenge with it still remains, though, and it's something that's kind of existed at all these stages, is you had to care about the infrastructure. You had to care about it a lot. Like there's still a lot of question of even if I'm building on a data mesh pattern, wow, does that mean I have like 7 data warehouses now? And how does that all relate to each other? And if I'm building on Databricks, like am I now learning data Azure in addition to this? It just creates a lot of that additional question marks. So where did this kind of take a next step with Fabric? Fabric starts to bring that data state forward toward a position where we're moving away from some of the slow ETL processes, even the ELT processes, to a SaaS platform where we start to move away from having to think about the infrastructure components of how it's served, still delivering mesh concepts, and doing it through a focus on real-time mirroring of operational databases into the Fabric environment that then can be used potentially still in bronze, silver, gold patterns, but getting away from the sense of like, I'm running a job, that job takes X hours, and then it finally gets to my location where I'm going to start doing something with it. And not that some of those stages don't exist after that point has been achieved. So it's very interesting how the cloud is starting to A, simplify the process of us using data, and B, get us to a point where we can bring that data to our consumers faster with less deltas between when we generate it in our operational database and when we can realize the value in our data state. That's what either a data scientist or an analyst that's taking advantage of it. But I think that's not really the only piece of why this is important. So I thought in like connecting that history, it would be worth giving you a frank discussion on why this move was brilliant from Microsoft's point of view. And again, this took me a little while to arrive at, and it'd be interesting to get your perspective if you still think it's brilliant, you know, coming out the door. So here's why I think it's brilliant. Microsoft has totally dominated the consumption layer. So if you think about the consumption layer being Power BI, Tableau had its time, just like a lot of other things. Right now, it's a dead platform walking. If you're still on Tableau, I'm sorry, it's over. Once Salesforce bought it, you kind of went into a position where Tableau started to really lose its relevancy in the greater market of skills. So Microsoft has done a great job of dominating the layer that people are using to get value from data. Now, that doesn't mean that like the consumption layer isn't also data science, which we'll get to later. But from a like analytical consumption layer where you have just huge numbers of business users getting value, building their own reports, creating their own capabilities in a consumption layer to analyze and see that data, Microsoft has done a very successful job of dominating that market, especially the legacy sort of analyst space. Just to kind of reinforce that point, Tableau is kind of in a position where it's not winning the race at the moment. just move off. So in the cloud infra game, Microsoft was having to compete head for head with other partners or other companies. So if you think about like, all right, Microsoft's got the consumption layer largely dominated. And then it gets into this competition at the infrastructure layer of, or is your data estate going on Azure? Is your data estate going on Google? Is your data estate going on AWS? Maybe all of them. And what do I do about it? Is it Azure, but actually Snowflake on Azure? Is it Azure, but actually Databricks on Azure? All of those conversations are happening, even though they own the consumption layer. So they own this consumption layer, and they're like, man, like we're still fighting with where the data goes, even though we own most of the consumption layer that people are using to access and work with the data. So by making a SaaS platform, what has happened, even if it's not as feature rich, and I'll fully admit that at the moment, even if in some cases it's not as feature rich as some of the other platforms that might exist today in the data like movement space, they immediately made every Power BI user a Fabric user. And that was brilliant. That move of enabling the commodity side of data engineering for the Power BI users was a great directional step. And the reason why is because it enables more people to be able to get into data engineering that may not have been individuals who are comfortable building an Azure estate with a subscription, with a resource group, with the deployment of Synapse, with the deployment of these Azure data factories that are moving data from point A to point B, all that stuff. They've taken that and said, yeah, I know you still have to do data movement. I know you still have to do like cleansing and things and labeling and everything that comes along with it. But you can do that in a SaaS platform without having to worry so much about the infrastructure. And by doing so, they shifted the whole conversation into this SaaS world. And that's creating a dramatically simpler use case and approach than what you're seeing from a competition. Instead of standing up a Azure Data Warehouse and all those components that we talked about, or a Snowflake instance, or putting in a GCP and then trying to get it so you can view it in Power BI, which like for a technical person, you're like, well, whatever, I can do that. But for like 99% of your business users, they have no idea how to do any of those things. Giving them the ability to surface data from business systems more quickly is really smart. And then if you see that integrate things like Copilot into Fabric for data analytics and starting to change it from being a conversation just about surfacing a dashboard to surfacing data to those business consumers, but data in a way that they can interject and talk to and have questions of and interact with in a variety of different ways, was a really smart move. So I also appreciate how they took this story and have then integrated Fabric with a whole variety of spots that already exist in the cloud. So the fact that our business systems are moving to the cloud allows Fabric to build real-time connections that don't have a negative impact on the operational platform, but mirror the data into Fabric and allow it to be used by the consumers to be able to get value faster than what we would have had to do in moving data from the on-premise environment through an ADF pipeline to a data warehouse to a different stages, and then finally to the consumer. So they've made that. I think this is where like Fabric is truly going to win out, is not just that they own the consumption path, they own the drop down into then doing data engineering in that same world, but also are facilitating data transfer capabilities that would have been really difficult to accomplish with any of those legacy approaches, with possible exception of like what Databricks is doing with some of their work right now. And Databricks is like totally tied into Fabric, by the way. Like their path continues forward in a really interesting way. So now that I understand how that all fits together, I can see why, if you're building a data state from the ground up and you have any desire to minimize the amount of work that your teams are doing Fabric fits into that picture in a really substantial way because it allows for you to offload some of that. Just like maybe talking about Office 365. I remember when they were first bringing this topic up, they were like, Nathan, I'm building the OneDrive for data. And it hit me like OneDrive for data, totally locked in this idea of like why that's so much simpler than the way we even dealt with SharePoint before, like going back in time, or just like the same way that like Teams simplifies using content in SharePoint in a sense. And then also like tells you how much it's going to create sprawl and other problems, but it definitely aligns to that idea. So I think it's really important to understand Microsoft is taking this path forward to create truly a SaaS ecosystem, and then also creating a opportunity for more people to get involved in a powerful way in the world of data. So why not a SaaS data state? I thought about this in sort of a sarcastic way, but I think it's really in a sort of non-sarcastic sense. I think it's easy for us to picture why you cannot have to use a SaaS data state. Because for some of us, doing these things are easy. Like I said, building a cloud data state is totally easy. For some of us, it is. For everyone's cloud data state is understandable and governed. Certainly, for some of us, it is. We are great at optimizing the cost of cloud data. I'll walk into a company and see their data state and know they could be using reserves. They could be simplifying those costs. The security layer is totally taken care of. Many companies, it is, but I think what you could start to see here is that for most companies, it's not. For most companies, it's not. So all these things that like we could say in with a straight face, they are easy, they are implemented, they are optimized, they are governed. But if you take 99% of your companies, they're not. It's not easy for them. It's not easy to make it understandable and governed. It's not easy to optimize the cost. It's not easy to optimize the security layer. All the data still is in the AS400. So these situations put us in a position where a SaaS data state for many companies is just straight up the best move. And it puts them in a position to be more supportable long-term without having to have as much of that concern. So the reasons why I think the SaaS data state straight up makes a ton of sense is I think it eases the value of getting, eases the process of getting value from data. The simpler we can make it, the wider the tent can be, that we still govern. Something like Fabric can truly provide a value, a effective path for our data to get to the hands of our consumers without needing to care as much about the underlying infrastructure that sits on it. It also allows us, and I think this is something I'm already seeing, and you should just be knowing yourselves, it provides a tremendous access to innovation that's built with faster time to value. Microsoft's data team is totally focused on Fabric, people. Like, they are putting all their energy into this. And you can see that by all the landing of AI innovation, Copilot platforms and such, that they're starting to light up within the Fabric interface and is already a known tool to the Power BI users. So it facilitates that ease of access to innovation because we've done the prep work. There's this idea of, like when you get a new light bulb, like we've been having to switch out light bulbs, right? Like you get a new light bulb and you just screw it into the same socket, right? We went from these like old light bulbs to like these, like there was the phosphorescent in the middle spot. Now we have these LEDs. Now you have LEDs that change colors and are IoT enabled. They still all plug into the same like generic twist in slot, right? Power BI is kind of like that, right? Like everybody from the consumption level, everybody's generally using Power BI. From the standpoint of notebooks and other things, that can plug in too. So like the consumption level kind of stays the same, but the ease of using the underlying infrastructure has gotten a lot simpler. So I think that's facilitating that ease of access to time to value because you've broadened the set of people that can actually use it. I think another piece of this that's really critical is less confusion over data lineage. And I've got a couple screenshots of that later. So data lineage has been like something that's always been an add-on to most of these data states. I mean, yes, you can see it in the context of ADF or other places to a degree, but understanding it end to end always took you applying Purview as like a secondary tool into the picture. And it felt like this very side add-on. And Purview's catalog was always a little weak. What I like about where they're going is they're kind of tying Purview and Fabric together in a way that provides a much more cohesive experience. And data lineage itself is a critical need just in general. So having less confusion around that path, I think is really important. Fourth thing here is this idea of real-time access to OLTP systems without slowing them down. Many of the companies we're working with are companies that they have huge real-time processing needs, and they then need to extract data from that to be able to use it in their reporting purposes. And one of the things I've been most impressed with on the Fabric side has been this idea of mirroring those systems into a Fabric replica that can be used very quickly for the needs of the consumer. And that's not something that was really possible with many of the on-premise systems historically, at least to the degree that you can do now. And then finally, I think cost optimization is going to be a big win here. Like building an on-premise system to do some very simple things, but needing to have it burst up for certain use cases, then having to move into building up like Synapse systems that required like very stock implementations of capacity. As you will see later, there's some great opportunity to just build on capacity across the board, like being able to get a set of reservation of capacity and processing, and then be able to use that for a variety of purposes across that estate, and then like sort of refill it as you need or get more capacity at lower discounted costs is going to provide a ton of value to companies that like don't want to pay for the big infrastructure or don't even want to pay to have like that middle tier infrastructure that they alternatively need to set up. So as we start going from here, I would love for you to continue dropping questions in the chat. I'll just take a break to see if there are any. There we go. Cool. Thank you. Nice question, Jamie Gunn. I'm just double checking for enterprise. One challenge that I've seen has been more on the data movement aspect from ERP, CRM destinations where the data can be consumed, line of business apps, or customer-facing websites. For example, near real-time replication versus batch, et cetera, et cetera. Folks that tend not to trust the data. Would love to hear how Fabric helps solve some of these concerns. Thank you for that question. I will address that as we go through. And Brian, feel free to come off if you have anything up to this point that you want to comment on, but don't feel that you need to.
Yeah, James' question was excellent. And I think you kind of touched on some of those topics, but I know you're going to get into it a little bit deeper. So, but keep the questions coming.
Cool, cool. Brian, if you want to respond to that also in chat, you can please do.
I will.
Okay. I thought this was from a Microsoft deck, but I thought it was great. This idea that I'm the chief data officer, I don't want to be the chief integration officer, every CDO. I think this is representative of like the hardest path in creating true data outcomes is getting A, agreement around data, and B, tying the systems together to be able to achieve outcomes from data. Some of that I think is unavoidable, even if you're in something like Fabric, because you simply have to gain agreement on what the first version of the truth is. But I think what Fabric is going to do is help us with lineage and help us with being able to pull data together in a way that is less dependent on multiple data platforms. I also want to note, this is, I think, a really important point. Surprisingly, Microsoft has built in Fabric real-time integration, not just into Microsoft. There's a fair amount of work they've also done into Google, AWS, and Snowflake as part of this platform that kind of shocked me in terms of like what they've done in the past. So I think you'll find it very interesting to see that if you do have ponds of data in different places, they do have this idea of called shortcuts or mirroring that will allow you to take data from these different repositories and mirror them real time as well. or shortcut them if they already exist. Okay, so wait, if Microsoft has a SaaS platform, what happens with all the stuff I've already been building? That's exactly this point. So the goal is for existing cloud platform resources to mirror them into Fabric. So if you already have many of these platforms, and especially, and I think this is kind of like a really important thing to note on, many of the times, if you've spent much time in the idea of a data mesh, like this has been like the topic du jour, and it's really what Fabric is built on, the idea of. It's just really, if I were to boil it down, it's that data has separation of concerns. Like the idea of throwing everything into a lake has never really been the end game. That we have separations of concerns in an enterprise, and we build those separations of concerns toward outcomes that need to be realized within the context of data, whether it's data science outcomes or it's data warehousing outcomes. And the goal for Fabric is to facilitate those different sources of data, whether it's a SaaS system like a CRM platform like Salesforce or CRM, Microsoft CRM, or an ERP like a SAP or something along those lines, or Dynamics F&O that lives in the Dataverse, or another data warehouse. All of those represent different parts of a data mesh that aren't going away. Like you may have a part of your application that's running in AWS. You may have part of your application that's running in Google or in Azure as a like full stack application. But we need to get that data into a data warehousing platform that still respects the separations of concerns, but lets it bring that data together. One of the goals Microsoft has had, and we'll talk about that with OneLake, is even in the context of separation of concerns, we want to store as few copies of the data as is reasonable. And we can then abstract that into the mesh separations of concerns without necessarily having to duplicate it, which is what a lot of mesh concepts have been historically built on, is this like publisher subscriber model of like creating copies of things, which just ultimately kind of slows down the process of getting it from point A to point B. So as you explore more about its capabilities in the separation of concerns level, I think you'll find that that really complements why a SaaS platform that sort of floats above a lot of these separate little instances of data is really helpful. Many of you are Databricks users. Databricks is like on fire in a good way right now. It's aiming to do the same kind of cool stuff in Fabric, right? So it's a partner of Microsoft's. They talk about it all the time. There's probably a series of whole conversations just about how you use Databricks in the conjunction with Fabric. That's something to go talk more about as well. Okay, so governance. How does governance work in this brave new world of yours? I had that same question. I talked about that a second ago. Purview, Fabric were sort of non-congruent for a while. Very fascinating. Like when they released Fabric initially, Purview couldn't even talk to it. And I was like, what the hell? What is going on here? Like, how does Purview fit into this picture? And now Fabric has full lineage in the context of its own interface, and Purview is linked into that. There's some very good talks on Microsoft Ignite from last year, but more that will be released, especially a build around the relationship of Purview and Fabric. I think those will be great to understand. Purview doesn't go away as a concept, and as a governance tool, Fabric is the place where everything ultimately lives. And I think what they're doing is realizing that like it needs to have the ideas of lineage and ability to look up data and simplification for the Power BI consumers right within that interface. Actually, if you're a Power BI user, you just drop yourself into Power BI right now, you see Fabric stuff. Like that's the thing that's so cool about it. Like it's not causing them to like even learn much of a new interface. It's providing that right within the world that they already live. So there's quite a bit happening, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So if you pivot into how Microsoft is positioning this, I think this is a great way to think about the four main pillars of how they think about Fabric. So one is a SaaSified analytics platform, everything in one place for you to go and surface data that exists either completely in OneLake or data that exists in other sources that you're attaching via shortcuts. And doing so in a way that requires less data connectivity work or infrastructure management And it just do not underestimate. Sometimes, yeah, do not underestimate the powers of the emperor. No, do not underestimate this state where you are previously needing to build up a complicated Azure architecture to get that data to Power BI. Like the numbers of projects that we've had to do just to do that, and then build up the appropriate sort of CAF landing zone for that to live in and secure it. And it's just so much goes into that picture. The idea of moving that to the side and just connecting the data in is really exciting. So that is not that you're not still building a pipeline and so on, but like the fact that you're really focused on the pipeline and less on the infrastructure of the pipeline is something that's really exciting to me. So the idea of a complete analytics platform, talk about that more. Lake-centric and open, what they really mean by open is that it's all Parquet. It's a platform that is following open standards. It's not something where they're trying to it's interesting for them to say that, right? Because they're like totally monopolizing the idea of the data platform, but it's also trying to be open at the same time. So you can learn more about that picture. Ultimately, I think the why of this is in simplifying the data side over here, and then even more over here, right? I think what the main result of this will be is like the shift that we had from SSRS reporting to Power BI, and there was 3 stages. There was like the SSRS, and then there was there's all those like interim versions of Power BI that just never really made it. But then there was that shift to IT building Power BI reports, to then the democratization of Power BI and its ability for any person to create meaningful views of data. I think we'll see that same shift in the data engineering space, maybe to a slightly less degree because of the size of some of the problems that are being solved. But you already see that in the data science world, where like data scientists just want access to the data. They don't want you to build a report for them. That same thing is going to happen with Copilot on top of data, where you're asking questions of data, you're asking Copilot to build you a Power BI dashboard. Those kinds of experiences in the hands of real consumers is going to further change the game. And I think that's truly what you're unlocking, is that ability to still lock in the version of the truth, but then be able to democratize access to data to gain insights that let people take action based upon that. So if we talk first about like what unified data platform means in the era of AI, it's all these things in the context of a SaaS platform. So data factory, data movement still exists, but it's done in a SaaSified way. Engineering, science, warehousing still exists, but in the context of a SaaSified way. Power BI already existed in that same interface. And then Activator, very interesting new technology that is available. And then OneLake being essentially the OneDrive of data storage. And then essentially what you're doing is you're getting capacity against these different functions that you share across the estate. So you're not like, well, what's my charge for Synapse? What's my charge for this? What's my charge for that? And then all different things. Your simplified sort of purchasing process, I think, is going to be very helpful for many companies. So same idea around this idea of OneDrive for data. It is a single SaaS lake for the whole organization. It's provisioned within the tenant the second you start using Fabric. And it facilitates many of the mesh concepts via a security foundation using serverless compute, doing the same kinds of workloads that you may have wanted to do, but done through having one copy. So you can still separate the permissions, but you now have a separation between the functional areas and the storage areas in a way that allows for that import-export to still happen, but allows you also to enforce a security model across the pattern without having to say, I'm going to take this finance content, I'm going to create another copy of the finance content because this other team wants to use it for a certain purpose. Like I can start to simplify that same picture. So really, I find this just really exciting that they're starting to go down that same kind of path. So, all right, for the essence of time, I will just sort of move that forward. ultimately, I think the idea of like having an RBAC model across something that once I put it into OneLake, I replicate the data there, I make it available, I bless it with certain certified dataset qualities, it then becomes something I can use security to then govern who can access and have less dispensing of the data across the estate that creates the same problem we have when people are using Excel in the first place. So there's all sorts of interesting innovations happening. The one that I think is most interesting is this idea of direct lake mode. We don't have a ton of time to explain it, but at the sort of like basis of this, it's I'm going to speed up the ability for me to deliver more value by having less time to duplicate and having the ability for me to provide value faster. So definitely go research some of that if you want to learn more about the details of direct lake mode. We don't have time to kind of go into it right now. But I think it's a really interesting example of an innovation that's being delivered on top of what Fabric has the capability to provide. Same with mirroring. Like I think mirroring is another really great example of that. Shortcuts, I mentioned this earlier. Shortcuts are the idea that data that exists in other places can be poked into Fabric as a accessible data store. So if I have data already in Azure, like let's say I have a Cosmos database is probably a bad example because I can mirror that. But like a Synapse warehouse or something in Amazon or Google, like I have the ability to shortcut that data without data movement into OneLake and then make that available to other functions. And I think that's great because it's respecting the fact that there's data across many clouds and is also consistent with that idea of a data mesh. So you want to learn more about that. I think that multi-cloud picture is something that Microsoft already kind of had with Power BI, right? Like people are still using Power BI as a primary consumption method. Now I'm sort of doubling down on that extent that like even if you had data in these other locations, I still can make it a shortcut so I can facilitate access to that in this place. And that's even happening in the context of Dataverse. That's a new thing. Like I was actually kind of surprised initially when they didn't have Dataverse connectivity into Fabric. I'm like, that's a big limiter, man. Like a lot of stuff's getting built in Dataverse. That's now a thing that's in preview as well. Okay, I think this idea of data domains has taken a huge step forward with data mesh, and it was a concept that was kind of coming into the fold even a couple of years ago, because people realized that like this idea of throwing everything in a big snowflake instance was, and that's the only place our data lives, was never necessarily going to work. Because we still had data in all these other places. So like we had data in this application's hub, or this other place over here. So we needed to understand that the data was primarily going to be there, but we had to have a further understanding that we had to have separation of concerns across these different locations and how we actually go about moving it or not moving it. So what OneLake is doing is it's trying to facilitate this access to data without having to do the data movement and facilitating essentially RBAC-based access to these different sets of data via these sets of concerns. And then can be certified by the domain experts. So like finance could say, this, and this is a certified part of the data set that's then exposed to other parts of the ecosystem without having to like just copy the data or have them have complete ownership over all parts of the movement. They can have a very business-centric understanding of the data and certify that part of the lineage without having to like have some of the complexities that we had in place with like other data mesh concepts. So I think understanding how like OneLake allows data mesh concepts to be brought into real life without having to have as much data movement, I think is a really nice win, and especially simplifies the picture for a lot of companies. Okay. So this idea of empowering every user, Power BI, obviously doing work in the context of like data science and so on, clearly. Something that they're launching in OneLake is something called Data Activator, which is a new no-code experience that allows you to trigger different rules based upon things happening in the context of the data. So if you, it's very similar to like, some things you might have done in like IoT Hub and so on. like the ability to see data flowing, be able to trigger actions based upon that data, and be able to either process it in a certain way or fire off an email or do something. Back up here. So that idea is something that, because they own like the other parts of this action platform, Power Automate, I could see Copilot Studio coming into play here, Teams, other custom activation on data. I think that's going to further enable what people do with it. Like, I think another way to say this is, many companies started with having Power BI be the main like reports, right, are the main way we consume data, and we take that, we take action on it. People are now discovering, like, it's not just reports are just a means to an end. Like, I'm actually trying to do a prescription. I'm trying to predict and prescribe action that is being taken based on data. Like, and that's something that a human oftentimes does, but maybe I'm replacing that with a data science workload or something else that's happening, and I need to think about it that way. But then as you get in this picture of, even when I'm predicting and prescribing, maybe I'm actually doing something with it, because once I've prescribed, I can just take action. And that's where this sort of world of like AI agents comes into play, that we're not just going to be like waiting to consume something and a person looks at it and does something. We're going to say, I know that when this happens, this other thing needs to happen. And I can build an AI agent that takes action based upon those things. So integrating into things like Power Automate and Copilot Studio and Teams are going to be opportunities for that action to actually happen without necessarily the human involvement on every step. So Data Activator is really cool, which kind of leads us to this idea of AI-powered kinds of ideas, which is a whole conversation in and of itself, but one that is really exciting. Like, many of the conversations I've had about Fabric have been entirely spurred on by people wanting to use Copilot in Power BI. Like, the idea of like, I want to use Copilot in Power BI on my data, and I love that Fabric is built on the idea of that. You should know that if you're going to use Copilot on your data, the big feedback from the people doing this actual work is, you need to structure your data well in Fabric for it to be useful by Copilot. Like, duh, but like, it's definitely something that we don't always think about, right? So the idea of labeling understandable data structures, being able to surface it for the right users, being able to do that in a way which can be consumed in a coherent way, that's all Copilot accelerated for sure. Because like, once that pre-work is done and lineage is in place, then a Copilot can build a report for the person they need, or answer questions about data that you would be asking about. Or you might even integrate a custom GPT you've been building in Copilot Studio right into the Fabric interface. That, I think, is really where the magic is going to happen. Like, this idea of like all this commoditized building on top of the data and top of Fabric, amazing. I'm so excited about the future of that versus like it being just sort of walled off inside of an IT organization. Okay, so how did this work from like the number one question, I guess, like, so what does this cost? Like, how do I even do this? So it's kind of broken down into two things. It's compute capacities and storage, essentially. So you get a little bit of that when you upgrade to Power BI Premium. There is a sort of capacity that you buy as you go through acquiring it. And I'll skip over this. I think this is, yeah, where did we go here? I'll get to that in a second, actually. So, okay. So I thought my capacity section was coming up. It will come up in a little moment here. So capacities, you buy them in just like sets of stuff, and that's shared across the entire set. You could say that's good or bad, but that's essentially how it works. You don't dispense, like, each of these are not bought in and of themselves. You buy like a CU, and then that CU is used across all the functions in compute capacities, and then you have storage capacities. At the end of this presentation, I have some kind of breakdown of what that essentially costs. So I'll show you that in a second. So there is a process of moving to Fabric from other things. If you are using Synapse, Synapse in any capacity, I think it is really important that you think about how Fabric will be the future of what you're doing. It is a much easier way to do a lot of things that they were building in the Azure Synapse experience or Azure Data Factory or Azure Data Explorer, but they have made it easier to use those same things in conjunction with Microsoft Fabric. So you can do a little research on that. It's definitely something they built pretty well. So from a data platform standpoint, we talked about OneLake. We talked about how OneLake has ability to surface data through different security layers. I think something important to comment on a little bit more is how Microsoft Purviews fit into this. I mentioned at the beginning that Microsoft Purview initially wasn't very well integrated into Fabric. That has changed in the last year. They've done the right work to be able to fit those two things together. Purview is a little bit of a question mark for a lot of people because they took Purview, which was very focused on the data state, and then they renamed the Office 365 side also to Purview to call it all Microsoft Purview. It used to be called Azure Purview. Now it's called Microsoft Purview. So to make sure there's no confusion, there is the Microsoft Purview capabilities for Office 365 centric data, files on Teams, and so on. And then there's also the Microsoft Purview that serves primarily the like data estate, big D data estate. And theoretically, they're the same product. In practice, they're kind of two sides of a coin in a sense of like their ability to engage across those two repositories. I anticipate them coming together, but in this case, I'm talking more about the data estate side of Purview. So its primary functions in this this ecosystem are the OneLake Data Hub, the ability to create endorsements or certification of data via certified datasets, its ability to create data lineage and impact analysis associated with certain data. That's similar to the same data lineage that exists in Fabric. So I think that's something you've seen happen that didn't really exist a year ago, is that kind of uniting of those two things. And then the ability to extract data and look for sensitivity information across the data state and be able to label and know where sensitive data exists. And that's something that many companies are really looking for. I was talking to a company the other day, and one of their biggest needs was, I don't know where sensitive data lives across my state. And it's even more complicated because I have data in Snowflake and this other place and this other place, but I don't know like where else it lives in my cloud environment. And it's like, well, you're covering like 25% of the data. Like there's all these other apps that have data, Cosmos database or this operational thing here or this thing here, and they all have data that's important. So Fabric is very close Purview is very close to Fabric, but Purview is also broader than Fabric because it realizes that like data exists in a lot of different places operationally and covers that as well. That's why there's still two tools in a sense of its general data governance. So there's the OneLake Data Hub. Its main goal is to facilitate discovery, reuse, finding data. It's more of a user experience, a consumer user experience. There's the idea of endorsements. So the idea of surfacing data specifically for the purpose of saying this data is one that you should use. It's a certified data set. This is like you're a consumer of data, you're a data scientist, you're a consumer. Use this data over this data that's named the same way. That's something we have a lot, right? We have these different like examples of data, but like we don't know which is the one that we should actually be using. That labeling of data, the creation of a catalog, the creation of information that data should be promoted is something that now is right within the Power BI experience because it was separated, right? Like you had it like in Purview, but not in the Power BI experience. Now that's part of what they have in Fabric. The idea of data lineage, I think this is super cool, like the relationship between where it came from and how it got to you, and then the idea of understanding its impact if you were to adjust a certain data pipeline, all happening within the same experience as Power BI is a huge step forward. Like not having to like here's my Power BI experience, but now I want to see the lineage, so I'm going to go over here. Like being able to do that all in the same context is beautiful, and then also is surfacing only data that people should see. Maybe like I have a lineage, but it only goes back to the spot or only shows me these trees, because realizing that I only have access to certain parts of it, I think is a really good part of this as well. And then the ability to understand what data is where based upon the ability to scan that data and see where sensitive data exists within the ecosystem, something that Purview also brings into the same picture. So how this works from a CU standpoint, we talked about this just a second ago. When you buy CUs, they're all pooled together. You don't have to pre-allocate. You can buy it as you need it. So like if you just like, if you're like a low capacity user and all of a sudden you need a lot more, you can allow it to scale up just for that use case and then scale back down as you don't need it, which can be a really advantageous activity. One of the things I didn't include in this is how fast some of this stuff can happen when you're using connected data sources Microsoft's already done the work on. The ability for data transfer to occur substantially more performant than what it was even able to do in Synapse or like beat the pants off Snowflake kind of stuff is just really crushing, really interesting. I haven't put much of it into this deck, but I think it's interesting to look into if you want to kind of get geeky there. How this works from a pricing standpoint, essentially there's a SKU, a capacity unit, and you can pay for that capacity on pay-as-you-go, or you can start to reserve. My recommendation is just start going pay-as-you-go, or just reserve at the like minimum level, and then determine what your actual consumption on a per monthly basis is. I know you look at this and you're kind of like, that's kind of French to me. And honestly, it's kind of French to everyone because we're still kind of figuring out what capacity truly looks like in Fabric, and that's just a honest statement on that, because it is something that's still like emerging. But I like the fact that you're basically just buying capacity, and the more capacity you buy, the cheaper it gets per thing, and you start to then do reservations, which was really complicated in Azure, especially with all the diverse spots. And then you can start to simply save like quite a bit once you know what you're going to use. So like once you know you need a certain amount of capacity, you can start reserving very quickly to be able to get that capacity. Same thing with OneLake. So OneLake storage is based on pay-as-you-go. You can start to go down the reservation route, but you can see the pay-as-you-go price of OneLake storage there as well. And then there's a lot of question marks around the data transfer, internet egress kind of things. There is a bandwidth pricing space, and we can provide a link to that. I don't know if you can actually click on this deck. Probably not. Yeah, I could provide that link in the chat.
I think, Nathan, have they turned that on yet? I think that they haven't turned on that pricing for egress yet.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's something that they've warned that there's going to be, but they haven't turned it on.
Thank you for that interjection. I didn't realize that wasn't turned on yet. So I guess now is a good time.
or maybe it is.
Let's check. So we can validate that. Okay. Holy cow. So we actually got through that. So now is a good time to pause. We have 7 minutes. We definitely did not cover everything there is to know about Fabric, and we don't know everything there is to know about Fabric, but we've used it now, so we know quite a bit. Now is a good time to ask some more questions. So if you want to drop some more questions in the chat, or you want to ask them of either Brian, I've totally monopolized Brian in this conversation. He's actually way smarter than me. So if you want to ask some more questions, now's a great time for those questions. While you're thinking about that, I had a question that was asked on the side, which is, I'm building a like less consumer-oriented platform, or sorry, like a less data analytics internal oriented platform. I'm building an external-oriented platform. Should I still put it in Fabric? I have an answer to that. Brian, I'd love to hear you like maybe expound upon that idea a little bit.
So from the beginning, from the beginning of Fabric last year when it was released, they did enable API access to your data. So that is something that is part of the roadmap to be able to operationalize that data. But it is an analytics platform first. So I think that over time you're going to see those features become better and more usable for like applications or operational data needs. But it is possible, but it's just getting better. So that's my perspective. What's yours?
Yeah, similar. Like it's clear it's like built internal analytics first with like data science, but I didn't even cover the data science thing. There's like a whole persona map of like different roles and optimized experiences for roles, and the data science exploration space is pretty new in there, but like very cool. Um, I think that's going to start to take hold that it's also the place for data that might be used in a like external operational platform, but I think that's something that'll emerge more. Very interesting. Okay, other questions? You can either come off mute or you can drop them in the chat either way. Okay. All right. So before you leave, fill out the survey. In that survey, I would love to hear feedback on whether this was helpful. This was or not helpful, or you loved it or you hated it. Either way, I always love feedback. I want to know what worked and what didn't work. Hopefully, it hit all the right nerves in terms of like information you want to learn from this, or at least was a good start for you. So that is something I would love for you to do. It also includes a potential action item of you having an envisioning workshop to learn more about your data and how Fabric might fit into it. And that's something that myself and Brian would love to have a conversation with you about. So as you leave, and that would be, if that's interesting to you, please push that button, and we would love to get some free time with you to talk about it. So other than that, if there aren't more questions, I wish you all a wonderful day and a great first day of March Madness. I'm sure that many of you will enjoy that, and a great start of spring. Thank
Go
you.
Marquette.
Woo, go Marquette.